What happens when a son tries to claim his mother's pension for himself? Dorothy refused to be taken advantage of, and set a challenge that turned her household upside down. What happened next surprised the entire neighborhood. Dorothy had always believed in the value of hard work. As a young woman, she'd balanced 2 jobs, raised her children single-handedly after her husband's sudden passing, and never missed a bill or a birthday. Now, in her late 70s, Dorothy's proudest accomplishment was her independence. A modest house filled with memories, a cozy garden, and a small but steady pension she'd earned through decades as a school librarian. Her son, Neil, however, had always taken a different view of life. Ambitious but restless, Neil bounced from one get-rich-quick scheme to another. Dorothy loved her son fiercely, but even she admitted he struggled to hold a job for longer than a season. When Neil showed up at her house one Monday morning, his car packed with boxes and an apologetic grin on his face, Dorothy's heart sank a little. "I just need to stay for a bit, Mom," Neil said, setting his things in the hallway. "You know, till I get back on my feet." Dorothy offered him a warm meal and the spare room, telling herself it was only temporary. Still, she couldn't help but notice the way Neil eyed her house, her new television, the stack of mail on the table, and especially the folder labeled "Retirement" tucked neatly in her desk drawer. The days slipped into weeks. Neil took over the living room couch with his laptop and phone, always working on something big, though Dorothy rarely saw a paycheck or heard of a job interview. He borrowed Dorothy's car for networking meetings, left dirty dishes in the sink, and treated the house like a hotel. Dorothy, ever patient, gritted her teeth and kept her worries mostly to herself. One afternoon, Dorothy came home from her weekly book club to find Neil rummaging through her desk. He quickly shut the drawer, smiling innocently. "Just looking for a stamp," he said, but Dorothy's instincts buzzed with unease. That night, she hid her pension papers and bank statements in a locked box. Soon after, Dorothy received an unexpected call from her bank. "We have a request to change your account's contact information and add an additional cardholder," the clerk explained. Alarmed, Dorothy assured the bank she hadn't made any such request and immediately set up new security questions. When she confronted Neil, he shrugged. "It's just easier if I can help you with bills, Mom. You're getting older, you could use a little help, right?" Dorothy's patience wore thin, but she stayed calm. "I can manage just fine, Neil. I appreciate your concern, but my finances are private." Neil pouted but let the subject drop, for a day or two. Soon, Dorothy began noticing small withdrawals from her account, $20 here, $40 there. Neil always had an excuse, gas money, groceries, or a loan to tide him over. When Dorothy asked him to return what he'd borrowed, he promised to pay her back as soon as the business takes off. But no business materialized. Frustrated, Dorothy reached out to her old friend Gloria for advice. "You've done enough for that boy," Gloria said firmly. "He's a grown man, Dorothy. Don't let him take advantage of your kindness." Dorothy knew she was right, but the idea of confronting Neil filled her with dread. Things came to a head one Friday morning. Dorothy received a letter from the Social Security office, addressed to Dorothy and Neil Chapman, confirming a request to split pension payments. Dorothy's hands shook as she read the letter. She stormed into the living room, waving the envelope. "Did you do this, Neil?" Neil looked uncomfortable but didn't deny it. "Mom, you're getting older. I thought it would be easier for both of us if the money went through me. I can handle your bills, help with the house, think of it as less stress for you." Dorothy's anger flared. "That pension is mine. I worked for every cent. You had no right." Neil's tone grew defensive. "You wouldn't be struggling if you let me help. Why can't you just trust me?" Feeling both betrayed and trapped, Dorothy called the Social Security office, explaining that she had not authorized any change. They agreed to investigate, but warned her to be vigilant. Dorothy changed her online passwords and moved her important documents to a friend's house. Neil sulked for days, alternating between apologizing and insisting he'd been misunderstood. Dorothy, meanwhile, made a decision, one that would change everything about their arrangement. The next morning, over breakfast, Dorothy looked her son in the eye and spoke with quiet authority. "If you want to stay under my roof, Neil, you'll have to start pulling your weight. No more freeloading. If you want my help, you're going to have to work for it." Neil gaped, unprepared for the steel in his mother's voice. Dorothy's days of quiet patience were over. Neil spent most of the day sulking after Dorothy's ultimatum. He lounged on the sofa, headphones clamped over his ears, pretending not to notice the way Dorothy moved purposefully around the house. But when lunch rolled around, he found himself standing awkwardly in the kitchen, watching his mother make sandwiches with brisk efficiency. "So, what exactly do you want me to do?" he finally grumbled. Dorothy didn't look up from slicing tomatoes. "We'll start simple. The garden needs weeding. The gutters need cleaning. The shed is a mess. There are plenty of things to do if you want to stay here." She pushed a list across the table, neatly written tasks for every day of the week. "If you do the work, you'll have a roof over your head and food on your plate. If not, you'll have to find somewhere else to go." Neil stared at the paper in disbelief. "You're treating me like a teenager." Dorothy's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then stop acting like one." Grumbling, Neil stomped out to the garden, still in his slippers. Dorothy watched him through the kitchen window, half expecting him to quit after a few minutes. But to her surprise, Neil spent most of the afternoon pulling weeds, clearing branches, and even righting a toppled fence post. He returned indoors filthy, exhausted, but for the first time in weeks, he didn't ask for money. That evening, Dorothy prepared a hearty dinner and invited Neil to join her. Over beef stew and fresh bread, the conversation shifted from tense to tentative. Neil complained about the heat and his sore back, but Dorothy noticed something new, a glimmer of humility in his voice. "Did you ever have to do stuff like this when you were my age?" Neil asked, more curious than resentful. Dorothy nodded. "Every day. Your father and I didn't have much, but we took care of what we had. Work wasn't optional, it was survival. I learned that the hard way." Neil fell silent, pushing his stew around the bowl. For a moment, Dorothy saw her son not as the schemer who'd tried to hijack her pension, but as the uncertain young man he'd been, always looking for shortcuts, always hoping for an easier way. The next morning, Dorothy woke early to find Neil already in the backyard, sorting through the clutter in the shed. The sight brought a bittersweet smile to her lips. She joined him, handing over a box of old tools. "Some of these still work, if you know how to use them," she said. Together, they cleared the shed, fixed a broken window, and set aside items for the next town recycling day. Neil struggled at first, grumbling about the weight of boxes, swearing under his breath when he smashed his thumb, but Dorothy refused to let him quit. She worked alongside him, showing him how to oil rusty hinges and patch up a cracked door. After a long day's work, Dorothy treated them to ice cream from the corner shop. As they sat on the porch, Neil rubbed his aching hands and stared at the garden, a look of reluctant satisfaction on his face. "Mom, I'm not used to this," he admitted, almost sheepishly. Dorothy shrugged. "No one is, until they have to be. But you'll get the hang of it." The days rolled by with a new, if uneasy, routine. Neil tackled each item on Dorothy's list, cleaning the gutters, painting the porch railings, hauling boxes for Mrs. Brooks down the street in exchange for a few dollars. Dorothy gave him praise when it was earned and corrections when needed, refusing to coddle him or soften her expectations. Slowly, the house and yard began to shine again. Neighbors noticed, offering compliments and sometimes hiring Neil for odd jobs. Dorothy felt a sense of pride she hadn't felt in years, not just for her home, but for the small glimmer of change she saw in her son. One afternoon, Gloria stopped by to see Dorothy and found Neil repairing the front steps. She raised an eyebrow, then winked at Dorothy. "Looks like you finally found the right incentive." That evening, Dorothy and Gloria sat over tea as Neil showered off the day's grime. "He's learning, Dorothy," Gloria said, "but don't let your guard down. Make sure he knows respect is earned." Dorothy nodded, grateful for her friend's wisdom. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in months, hope flickered in her chest. That night, she locked away her pension papers and bank cards, then sat by her window, watching the moonlight fall across the tidy lawn. Her home felt safe again, her rules restored. And as Neil's snores drifted down the hallway, Dorothy promised herself she would never again let anyone, family or not, take her hard-earned independence for granted. As July deepened, the days on Dorothy's property grew busier. Neil, now used to early mornings, dragged himself out of bed at sunrise, sometimes before Dorothy even called his name. He grumbled less as he slipped on old work boots, knowing the daily list of chores would be waiting by his coffee mug. Each day brought a new lesson. Dorothy taught Neil to prune the hedges without damaging the roots, to patch a leaky hose, and to replace the broken latch on the garden gate. Sometimes she supervised, but just as often, she left him to solve problems on his own. Neil struggled at first, misreading instructions, snapping tools, or leaving jobs half-finished, but Dorothy insisted he return and complete each task properly. Neighbors began to notice the changes. Mrs. Brooks, who'd once whispered about that grown son lazing around, now waved at Neil from her porch. Mr. Patel from next door even hired him to help clear out an overgrown alley behind his garage. Dorothy watched these small transactions with quiet satisfaction. Her faith in discipline and hard work confirmed a little more each day. Still, not all was smooth. Neil occasionally slipped into old habits. Once, Dorothy found him on his phone in the shed, avoiding the heat and idly scrolling through job ads, though she suspected he wasn't truly looking for work. She caught him, too, grumbling on the phone with friends about his slave driver mother and never-ending chores. Dorothy confronted him, her voice steely. "If you're going to stay here, you'll finish what you start. Or you'll have to find another place to stay." Neil stormed off that afternoon, returning only at dusk. He muttered an apology and got back to work, but Dorothy noticed something had shifted. For the first time, Neil started asking her advice before tackling repairs. When the front faucet needed fixing, he watched YouTube tutorials, but then turned to Dorothy for guidance with the old, finicky plumbing. When the mailbox post snapped during a storm, he patched it and then painted it to match the house, a small touch Dorothy hadn't asked for. Dorothy was careful to reward improvement. She praised Neil's effort, occasionally handing him a few dollars from odd job earnings to buy lunch or treat himself. "You earned this," she said, making it clear that nothing came for free anymore. Neil didn't argue. Instead, he thanked her, quietly pocketing the bills. On weekends, Dorothy and Neil established new routines, visiting the farmer's market, fixing up old furniture in the garage, or inviting Gloria for Sunday lunch. At the table, Gloria teased Neil about his transformation, and Dorothy felt a pang of both pride and cautious hope. But old patterns die hard. Neil's frustration sometimes resurfaced. When Dorothy asked him to help Mrs. Brooks carry groceries home, Neil complained loudly until Dorothy stopped him in his tracks. "You have two choices, Neil. Help others and build trust, or pack your things." With neighbors watching from across the street, Neil blushed, then silently took the bags from Mrs. Brooks and followed her inside. That evening, Dorothy sat on the porch, reflecting on how far they had come and how much work remained. She wrote in her diary about her resolve to never let her guard down again, even as she hoped that Neil might finally be learning the value of hard work, respect, and real responsibility. The house felt lighter, the garden brighter, and Dorothy, for the first time in a long while, believed that the future could hold more than just struggle. Still, she knew one thing for certain. In her home, her rules would always come first. Midway through August, Dorothy's house became a hive of activity. With Neil's help, she organized a long-overdue garage sale. Boxes that had gathered dust in the attic for decades were hauled outside. Neil balked at first. "Nobody wants this old junk, Mom." But Dorothy persisted, sorting through items one by one, assigning him jobs, and showing him how to set up tables and price tags. On the morning of the sale, the neighborhood buzzed with visitors. Neil played cashier, managing the change box while Dorothy chatted warmly with old friends and new faces alike. At first, Neil fumbled, giving the wrong change and mixing up prices, but Dorothy coached him, nudging him to slow down and double-check. Soon he found a rhythm, cracking jokes with customers and even upselling a battered set of gardening tools to Mr. Patel. The event was a success. By noon, half the tables were empty, and Dorothy counted a tidy stack of bills. She handed Neil his share. "For your work," she said, smiling. Neil looked genuinely surprised. "You mean it?" Dorothy nodded. "You earned it. It's not a handout." After the sale, Neil helped tidy the yard, then suggested they use some of the profits to fix the porch steps. Dorothy agreed, and together they purchased lumber and spent the afternoon measuring, sawing, and hammering. By evening, the steps were solid, freshly painted, and safer than they'd been in years. Word of Neil's efforts spread through the neighborhood. Mrs. Brooks dropped off homemade cookies with a thank-you note, and Mr. Patel asked Neil to help organize a community cleanup. For the first time, neighbors greeted Neil with genuine smiles. Dorothy watched with a cautious sense of hope, careful not to let her guard down but quietly proud of her son's progress. Despite these changes, old habits sometimes crept back. One afternoon, Dorothy noticed several missed calls from an unfamiliar number on her phone. Neil confessed he'd tried to set up a side hustle selling items online, using Dorothy's address as a pickup spot without asking. Dorothy was furious. "This is my home, Neil. My name, my reputation. You must respect it." She made him call every buyer and cancel the sales, watching to make sure he took responsibility. The next morning, Dorothy received a visit from the mailman. A letter, addressed to Neil, had arrived from the unemployment office. Dorothy handed it to Neil with a firm warning. "You're welcome here, as long as you keep your promises. If you want to earn your way, you have to do it honestly." Chastened, Neil admitted he'd been tempted by easy money, but promised to stick with real work. That week, he redoubled his efforts, not only around the house but also by helping neighbors paint fences, walk dogs, and move furniture. The neighborhood began to see Neil not as a burden, but as someone willing to pitch in. Dorothy and Neil also found time to reconnect outside chores. On Sunday evenings, they played cards with Gloria and her husband, laughter filling the living room like old times. Dorothy taught Neil to make her famous apple pie, and the two spent an afternoon baking, teasing, and sharing stories of family and perseverance. Still, Dorothy remained vigilant. Each night, she locked away her pension documents and checked her accounts. She reminded Neil, sometimes gently, sometimes sharply, that trust was earned, not given. By the end of the month, Dorothy's home had never looked better. The garden flourished, the porch gleamed, and for the first time in years, Dorothy allowed herself a little pride in Neil's progress. But she knew, deep down, that their new arrangement was still a test, for both of them. That night, as she watched the sunset from her porch, Dorothy resolved to keep her standards high and her boundaries firm. She had worked too hard, for too long, to let anyone, no matter how much she loved them, take her dignity or security for granted again. September brought a chill to the air and new challenges to Dorothy's routine. The days grew shorter, but the work-for-stay arrangement with Neil only intensified. With the leaves falling fast, Dorothy assigned Neil to rake, bag, and haul them to the curb, no easy feat given the towering oaks around the house. Neil complained about his aching back, but, under Dorothy's steady gaze, he finished the job and even helped neighbors clear their yards for a little extra pay. Dorothy noticed subtle changes in Neil's attitude. He rose earlier, often without prompting, and checked the task list before pouring his morning coffee. He started planning ahead, budgeting the money he earned, and taking pride in each completed job. Sometimes, Dorothy overheard him bragging to Gloria about his handyman skills, a glimmer of the confidence she'd always hoped he'd find. Yet setbacks persisted. One Saturday, Neil came home late after drinks with friends, clearly having spent more than he'd earned that week. Dorothy confronted him at breakfast, refusing to let old habits slip back unnoticed. "If you want to live here, you can't waste what you've worked for. You need to show me you can be responsible." Neil sulked, but admitted his mistake, promising to pay back the money and cut back on nights out. Dorothy remained firm. She had Gloria drive her to the bank so she could update her account security and review her finances, just in case. Gloria nodded approvingly. "You're doing the right thing, Dorothy. You can love him, but you can't let him ruin what you've built." Work at home continued. Dorothy assigned Neil to repaint the fence and repair a broken window in the attic. When he struggled, she taught him, then let him fix his mistakes, no matter how long it took. Dorothy also sent him to help Mrs. Brooks with her groceries and to Mr. Patel's garage to organize tools. Each time, she checked in with the neighbors afterward, ensuring Neil held up his end of the bargain. Word began to spread beyond the block. A couple from the next street hired Neil to fix their porch steps, and a retired schoolmate of Dorothy's paid him to prune an overgrown hedge. For the first time, Neil kept a small notebook, jotting down jobs, payment dates, and notes about each customer. Dorothy watched him balance pride with humility, knowing he was finally learning the difference between working for something and expecting a handout. In the evenings, the house felt warmer. Dorothy and Neil watched old movies together, played cards, and even started a jigsaw puzzle on the kitchen table. Sometimes, Neil would share stories of his childhood or ask about Dorothy's own youth, questions he'd never cared about before. Still, the fear of betrayal lingered in Dorothy's heart. When a strange charge appeared on her account, she immediately questioned Neil. He showed her a receipt for groceries, carefully keeping every bit of proof. Dorothy was both relieved and quietly proud. Autumn deepened, and Dorothy hosted a small dinner for her closest friends and neighbors. Over roast chicken and apple crisp, the conversation turned to family and forgiveness. Gloria raised a toast to Dorothy for never giving up, and to Neil for finally learning what it means to be needed. That night, Dorothy stood at the window, watching leaves swirl in the moonlight. She felt the fragile peace in her home and hoped it would last. For the first time in years, she was not afraid of what tomorrow might bring. October arrived with blustery winds and the promise of winter just around the corner. Dorothy's home, now glowing with fresh paint and tidy gardens, drew compliments from neighbors and even the mailman. Neil kept busy as the air turned crisp, mending the garage roof, weather-stripping windows, and stacking firewood for the colder months ahead. Dorothy noticed him checking tasks off his list, less for her approval and more from a quiet satisfaction that seemed to grow inside him. But new challenges appeared as quickly as the leaves fell. Neil's odd jobs began to dwindle. Many neighbors finished their autumn projects, and work slowed. Dorothy could see Neil's anxiety building as he checked his phone for responses to job ads that rarely came. Restless, he sometimes paced the house or snapped at Dorothy over minor frustrations. Sensing his unease, Dorothy suggested he help her set up for the upcoming neighborhood harvest festival, a tradition she'd helped organize for years. At first, Neil was reluctant, dismissing it as busy work for retirees. But when Mrs. Brooks praised his work and Mr. Patel insisted Neil was indispensable, his spirits lifted. Soon he was hauling hay bales, stringing lights, and even fixing a broken speaker for the event's main stage. The festival day was clear and brisk. Dorothy manned the bake sale booth, her famous pies selling out in record time. Neil ran errands, set up tables, and mingled with neighbors. Children greeted him with high fives, and a few of the older teens even asked if he'd help set up their haunted house for Halloween. Dorothy watched, heart swelling, as her son moved through the crowd not as a burden, but as a valued member of the community. But progress brought new tension. That evening, after the festival, Neil received a phone call from an old friend with another opportunity. A shady-sounding gig promising quick cash and little work. Dorothy overheard part of the conversation and confronted Neil after he hung up. "You're not going back to old habits, are you?" she asked, her voice sharp with worry. Neil hesitated, then shook his head. "No, Mom. I'm not proud of the things I've done before. I won't let you down." Dorothy made him promise to ignore such offers. "Real work is worth more than fast money," she said. Neil nodded, looking genuinely chastened. Dorothy felt a small knot of fear loosen inside her. The days grew colder, and Neil found new ways to help around the house. He volunteered at the local food bank with Dorothy, surprising her with his patience and easy manner with strangers. For Thanksgiving, he suggested inviting Mrs. Brooks and Mr. Patel, turning their traditional dinner into a festive gathering of friends and neighbors. As they sat around the table that evening, laughter and stories filling the room, Dorothy realized her house was no longer just a safe haven for herself. It was becoming a place of connection for others, thanks in no small part to Neil's growing sense of responsibility. After everyone left, Dorothy handed Neil a plate of leftovers and sat beside him. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "You're finally starting to see what real work and real trust can bring." Neil smiled, tired but content. "I think I am, Mom. I really think I am." That night, Dorothy locked away her pension papers as always, but for the first time, she wondered if there might come a day when she wouldn't need to. Winter set in early, blanketing Dorothy's neighborhood with the first heavy snow. Neil grumbled at the chill, but rose each morning to clear the walkway, salt the steps, and check on the elderly neighbors who couldn't manage the cold on their own. He dug out Mrs. Brooks' car twice and spent a Sunday afternoon fixing Mr. Patel's frozen gutter. The neighbors, grateful and surprised, brought over casseroles, cookies, and in one case, a hand-knitted scarf Neil wore with secret pride. Dorothy watched these scenes unfold, her pride in Neil tempered by caution. Each day she saw him grow more self-reliant and, perhaps more important, respected by those around him. But there were moments when his frustration flared. When odd jobs dried up or a neighbor forgot to pay on time, Neil sometimes snapped or moped around the house. Dorothy refused to let him wallow. "Nothing worth having comes easy," she reminded him. "Every season is work, Neil. That's how you build a life." Their home life changed too. Dorothy encouraged Neil to try new things, cooking stews from scratch, fixing the old radio, even taking over her bills 1 week under her careful eye. At first, Neil made mistakes: an oversalted soup, tangled extension cords, a late payment that Dorothy caught before the penalty hit. But each slip-up became a lesson. Instead of blaming Dorothy or the world, Neil began to laugh at himself, then try again. One icy afternoon, the power went out. Dorothy and Neil worked by flashlight to set up candles, find the extra blankets, and check in on neighbors. When the lights flickered back, Dorothy found Neil at the window, looking out over the snowy street. "I think I like being the person people count on," he said, almost to himself. Around Christmas, Dorothy noticed something she hadn't expected: Neil using his own money to buy small gifts for the neighbors he'd helped: a new kettle for Mrs. Brooks, batteries for Mr. Patel's radio, a pair of warm gloves for the mailman. He even wrapped Dorothy's present himself, a new journal, embossed with her initials. On Christmas morning, he handed it to her, shy and proud. "For everything you do. For always believing in me, even when I didn't deserve it." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears as she hugged her son, the years of struggle and disappointment melting for a moment in the warmth of his gesture. The new year arrived, and with it, Dorothy's annual review of her finances. She sat at the kitchen table, papers spread out, Neil by her side. For the first time, she explained every number, every account, and every safeguard she'd put in place. "It's not about not trusting you," she told him. "It's about making sure what I've built lasts, and that you know how to protect it, too." Neil listened closely, asking questions, taking notes. He didn't ask for access, nor did he try to take shortcuts. For Dorothy, it was a milestone, a sign that maybe, just maybe, her son had finally learned the true value of trust and hard work. That evening, as they watched the snow fall, Dorothy felt a cautious hope that had eluded her for years. Her house was secure, her heart guarded but open, and her son, flawed, stubborn, but finally growing, was by her side, not as a burden, but as an ally. By early spring, the snow melted and Dorothy's house came alive with the promise of a fresh start. Tulip shoots poked through the thawing earth, and sunlight poured through clean windows, glinting off the polished banister that Neil had repaired himself. For the first time in years, Dorothy's home truly felt like a place of comfort and safety, a place she was proud to share, and not just to defend. Neil, too, had changed. He set his alarm without prompting, kept a notebook of chores, and even took on small repair projects for neighbors without waiting to be asked. His network of local clients had grown. What began as odd jobs was now a steady stream of requests. Word had spread about his reliability, and though he sometimes grumbled about sore muscles, he always delivered on his promises. Neighbors paid in cash, home-cooked meals, or simply gratitude, and for the first time, Neil seemed to take real pride in honest work. Dorothy maintained her boundaries. Every week she reviewed her pension, balanced her accounts, and checked that her personal documents remained locked away. She discussed every major decision with Neil, but the final word was always hers. Their relationship had found a new balance, one built on earned trust rather than obligation or guilt. As the weather warmed, Dorothy suggested hosting a neighborhood picnic, inviting all the people Neil had helped over the last months. Neil was hesitant at first, but Dorothy insisted, "Let them thank you. You've earned it." The day was bright and breezy, the backyard filled with laughter, folding chairs, and the scent of fresh grass. Neighbors brought casseroles and pies, and Mr. Patel raised a toast to Neil, to the hardest working man on the block, and to the mother who taught him what it means to earn respect. Dorothy beamed with pride. Neil accepted the applause with a shy smile, glancing at his mother across the yard. That evening, as they cleaned up together, Dorothy placed a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't just work for me, Neil. You worked for yourself. And you changed this home." Spring brought more opportunities. Neil was offered a part-time job with a local handyman service, and Dorothy encouraged him to take it. "You're ready," she said. "And I'm always here if you need help, but you can stand on your own now." The house felt quieter as Neil spent more time working away from home, but it was a peaceful quiet, one Dorothy had missed for so long. She tended her garden, invited friends for tea, and kept her finances, and her boundaries, secure. The pride she felt in Neil's growth mingled with a renewed sense of confidence in herself. One evening, Neil brought home a small gift, a silver picture frame. Together, they placed a recent photo inside, mother and son in the blooming backyard, smiling with genuine ease. Dorothy set the frame on her mantel, a symbol of everything they had survived and the new respect they had built. That night, as Dorothy wrote in her journal, she reflected on the journey. Her pension remained hers, her dignity intact. Her son, once lost, had earned his place in her life through effort, honesty, and change. Dorothy closed her diary, content. Her legacy would not be measured by what she had given away, but by what she had taught. Work is love in action. Respect is never free. And in the end, the things you fight for matter most.